Okay, you want to know about the family finances?
A little ways outside of Dallas, Hank Hill lives with his wife and son in the relatively small town of Arlen, Texas, selling propane and propane accessories. They really look like they're living the American dream with a house, dog, and just about everything that a family could reasonably want. But are their finances as clean as the sweet burn of propane? Or are they much better or worse off? Well, let's get into that and talk about just how broke Hank Hill actually is. And I guess consider this your official spoiler warning for a cartoon that ran for 13 years and ended almost a decade ago. And hey, while we're here, comment down below what you'd like to hear me talk about next. It definitely helps the algorithm not hate my channel. As is customary when I talk about these kinds of videos on my channel, let's get kind of meta and talk about the show's timeline. Or I guess lack of timeline. King of the Hill operates kind of in between a floating timeline and a more consistent timeline. So while some of the characters do age for the most part, it's not in a consistent way. John Redcorn is 36 in season 5 and 40 in season 9, and Luann ages from 18 to 21 over the course of the series and eventually gets married and has a baby. For our purposes of this video, we'll be treating the entirety of the series as taking place roughly over the course of 4 years, despite any references to whatever pop culture may be taking place during the air date of the episode, like the Y2K episode. Instead, I'll be splitting the show up by season. Seasons 1, 2, and 3 would be 1997, seasons 4, 5, and 6 would be 1998, seasons 7, 8, and 9 would be 1999, and the final 4 seasons, 10, 11, 12, and 13 would be 2000. Now let's get into Hank and a bit of his backstory. Hank was born April 19th, 1953 in New York City to Matilda May and Cotton Hill, a World War II veteran who had lost his shins in battle. In high school, Hank would begin dating Peggy Platter, whom he would later marry, but we'll get to that part in a bit. Upon his graduation from high school in 1971, Hank would attempt to join the military, but would be ultimately turned down. However, I do believe that upon his graduation, that Hank would probably be kicked out of his house by Cotton, judging by their, we'll call it, less than ideal relationship. At this point, we'll have Hank move in with a couple of his friends from high school, Dale Gribble and Boomhauer, and get his first job at Arlen's Jeans West. Let's start with Hank's first job. Hank would likely be working full-time at Arlen's Jeans West and making minimum wage. We'll estimate that during his time there, he is making around $1.40 an hour, which is $2,912 each year before taxes. As for their apartment, the New York Times ran an article back in 1973 discussing the median rent for an apartment being $108 a month in the year 1970. We'll round that down to $100 a month and divide that up 3 ways for each of the 3 roommates. Meaning that for his time living with Dale and Boomhauer that Hank is only paying $33 a month or $396 a year. Now we can get into how we're doing our math. We'll start with Hank's base salary for each year, do some tax math, take off minor yearly expenses like housing payments, car payments, rent, and have him put away 20% of what's left in a bank account. I think that Hank would be pretty consistent with that 20% with what we know about him and his, we'll call it, consistency. We also know that he is good at creating and sticking to budgets, so that, helps. We'll have his bank account gaining an average of 2% interest annually. With that math in mind, we can move forward ahead to 1980. This would be a pretty big year for Hank. Let's start with his professional life. Going into this year, Hank would still be working at Arlen's Jeans West. But a chance encounter in his impeccable salesmanship would lead to him being offered a job by Buck Strickland, owner of Strickland Propane, after Hank sells him a pair of jeans. I think that it happens this year for a few different reasons. For starters, during the scene, we hear the song You Make My Dreams by Hall & Oates being played in the mall. This song was, of course, released in the year 1980. We also get another sign pointing towards this season in season 7's episode, The Good Buck. In this episode, a pretty heavily intoxicated Buck mentions that Hank has been working for him for 20 years. According to our timeline, this episode would take place in 1990, with 20 years earlier being 1979. Which is pretty dang close. If you ask someone who worked somewhere for 19 years how long they worked at a place, they'd probably just say 20 years. A propane manager today can make around $56,000, but as we know, Hank is not actually a manager, rather he's an assistant manager. This is most likely a way for Buck to get away with paying Hank less, who's mostly in it for his love of propane and propane accessories. For this reason, we'll reduce Hank's salary from what it could be down to the equivalent of $45,000 each year. And of course, we'll be adjusting that number each and every year for inflation. And one final note for Hank's salary, he does get a $1,000 bonus every year, which we will also be factoring in. Still in 1980, let's move on to Hank's personal life. I'll have this be the year that Hank and Peggy get married. We don't have any exact years on this throughout the series, so this is kind of my best guess. In a photo we see from Hank and Peggy's wedding, Bill is obviously starting to bald. This would put it a little further away from when they were all in high school, considering how much hair Bill had at that point. I would also assume that Hank would want to have a more stable and reliable job before marrying Peggy. With his recent upgrade in salary and a new position at Strickland Propane, this would be the perfect time for Hank to pop the question. Which means that as of this year, we can start taking Peggy's salary into account as well. Peggy, for the bulk of the series, operates as a substitute teacher. Today she'd be making around $26,000, which will adjust for inflation for each year that she's working. As for expenses, the two of them would pay for a wedding this year. An average wedding in Dallas cost $28,810 today, or $9,351.72 back in 1980. But that's in Dallas, and while that's close to Arlen, it would be much, much cheaper to throw a wedding in a smaller town rather than a major city. For that reason, we'll drop the cost of what the wedding would be back to $5,000 in 1980. Finally this year, Hank and Peggy would move in together following their marriage. I don't think that they would while they were still dating because of how deeply religious Hank and Peggy both are. We'll continue on with our rent the same way, but have them take over the majority of the rent, which at this time comes out to $1,296 per year. A few years later, Hank and Peggy would buy their vehicles that we see them driving for the majority of the series. Hank is said later in the series to have been driving his truck for 20 years, though the specific type of truck didn't actually exist until 1983. So for that reason, I'll be having him buy his truck that year. New, a 1983 Ford F-150 could go for $9,000. We'll have Hank put $1,000 down and pay the rest off over the next few years. As for Peggy's car, her Buick could go for around $8,000. We'll have them put $500 down for Peggy's car and have them pay that off for the next few years as well. They'll be spending $3,996 per year until the vehicles are paid off. In 1985, Hank would have a couple more major life changes. For starters, this would be the year that Hank would overcome his narrow urethra and he and Peggy would have their only child, Bobby Hill. We'll be having Hank and Peggy spend the equivalent of $5,000 each year on Bobby. I think that this would also be the year where Hank and Peggy buy their home. We know that they buy their home in the mid to late 80s, so 1985 and having it correspond to Bobby's birth makes sense. Their home has 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a garage, an attic, and a few other minor rooms. A similar house can go for around $235,000. But this was back in 1985 and homes were a good bit cheaper than they are today. Homes in 1985 cost around 40.65% of what they cost today. That means that his home would have cost $95,527.05, which will round up to $96,000. In the episode of Rich Hank, Poor Hank, we see that Hank is paying $745.83 a month, or $8,949.96 a year. If Hank were going to take out a 15-year loan, in order to have monthly payments similar to that, he would need to put down $18,700, which is actually a little less than 20%. And that actually seems pretty likely. So we'll have Hank and Peggy paying the nearly $9,000 a year for the next 15 years until 2000. But more on that in a bit. Coming out of 1985, Hank would have $691.71. At this point, we can kind of fast forward through to the beginning of the series, 1997. This is when Luann, Hank and Peggy's niece, moves in with the family. For this reason, we'll be adding an extra $3,000 onto what the Hills are paying for children each year, despite the fact that Luann isn't exactly a child. The next year, Hank's truck, on its last legs, would be hit by a train and destroyed. Hank then replaces his truck with yet another red truck. We'll estimate that his second truck is worth $10,000. We'll have him put $2,000 down and pay the rest off over the next several years, with him paying $2,208 a year until the car is fully paid off. This leads us to a bit of a continuity error. In another episode, we hear that a car salesman had sold Hank many overpriced cars throughout the years, despite the fact that he's had the same truck for years. We'll just kind of ignore that for the sake of this video. In 1999, Bobby would overhear his parents talking about Hank's bonus check from Strickland Propane and believe that that's what Hank makes a day. That leads Bobby to spending a bunch of money on things like clothes, a limo, and even a jet ski. Hank pays off everything that Bobby buys aside from the jet ski, A higher end jet ski can go for close to $20,000. We'll be estimating that Bobby spent around half of that, so $10,000, with any money that Hank would have made from selling the jet ski just going to paying it off. So we'll just have Hank spending $4,000 this year. Finally, in 2000, Peggy would be fired from her position as a substitute teacher. She eventually finds work as a real estate agent. We'll estimate her salary at the equivalent of $50,000, which is a little below the national average. This is to try and account for Arlen most likely having a below average real estate market. And that's where we'll end our math at the end of the series. By this point, Hank would have $70,695.69 in his bank account. His home, which was very recently paid off, would be worth $149,671.05. This means that Hank Hill, simple propane salesman, is worth $220,367.18, which is actually a lot better than I thought it would be. But anyways, this has been 10K Bill, and thanks for watching. Comment down below what you'd like to hear me talk about next, follow me on Twitter at 10K Bill, support us on our Patreon, and of course, make sure you subscribe for all your entertainment related content.